Welcome to Life and Legacy Talks, where we explore the stories, decisions, and defining moments that shape not just successful lives, but meaningful legacies. Today we are joined by Francois Fouchè, a specialist in international estate planning, offshore structuring, and cross-border wealth preservation. Francois holds 4 formal qualifications in law and tax, including an LLM, and has more than 20 years of experience in advising high net worth individuals and families on global estate and succession planning. Francois, welcome. It's great to have you with us. Thanks for taking the time to be here. How's everything on your side?
No, thanks for having me, Andre. No, all good, and happy to have a safe landing in Cape Town yesterday. So it was quite interesting with the weather they've been experiencing, but yeah, still trusting our pilots, so all good.
Francois, we've mentioned in the introduction that you have many different qualifications. What first made you decide to study LLB, and then after your LLB studies, what made you decide to go into the world of estate planning and specifically offshore planning and structuring, because it's a quite interesting shift?
I think I was quite lucky, Andre, from a young age. I always wanted to study law. I think it was never like I was considering becoming something else. So it was quite a natural progression. And I think I remember quite vividly in my last year of LLB, I had a lecturer that actually came from practice, and he was talking about trusts and structuring your affairs. And it was like just very interesting to me. But one never knows how your career path would go. So I was quite lucky that I ended up being offered the opportunity to work in that field. And I joined a wealth management business, which was just eye-opening. I think as professionals, we should actually all get acquainted with estate planning concepts and just general financial personal planning. It's something that I found, speaking to clients over the years, it's something that's lacking. So I was quite fortunate. So I was interested, when I had that talk from the lecturer. And from there on, I was, I guess, just lucky. And it all went according to plan.
We had that discussion the other day where you actually mentioned that you've spent some time residing in Mauritius. How was that experience like for you, both professionally and personally?
Andre, it was an amazing experience. Lucky enough to live there for 3 years with my wife. But I remember in the early years when I spoke to people, especially the offshore trustees coming from places like Jersey and Guernsey, they would say, no, they need to get off the island. So they used to have a lot of leave. And I thought, well, I don't understand that. But after living in Mauritius for 3 years, I now have a better understanding. It is true. The island gets a little bit small. So you need to get off the island quite often. But it was a fantastic experience from a personal perspective. We were quite lucky to live on the coast, exposure to different culture, different way of doing things. And from a professional perspective, I think I learned a lot, and it gave me exposure on a practical side of things in the international space, and from a regulatory perspective, dealing with the banks, etc. It's different when you sit there compared to driving sort of from a South African perspective. So it was a very valuable experience, but also happy to be back in South Africa.
Francois, actually a question that I have for you is, how did you end up in Mauritius, and why did you decide to come back to South Africa? I think that's the question I've been wondering about.
Yeah, so I think it's, life is interesting. You don't plan for everything. So sometimes opportunities cross your path, and you need to decide if you're going to take that opportunity or not. But essentially, we had to move to Mauritius to set up and expand our offshore offering. And that's how I ended up going to Mauritius. But the clients have always been in South Africa, and I quite enjoy the consultation space. So it was a natural draw for me to come back to South Africa and spend more time with the clients. And to be very honest, and I don't particularly enjoy humid weather. So, so after 3 years in Mauritius, I think I had enough of that, and I was looking forward to coming back to South Africa.
And how was the shift between going from South Africa to Mauritius and adapting to the way they do things on their side?
It's quite fascinating. Obviously growing up in South Africa, you're used to the South African culture and the way of doing things. And all of a sudden you're dealing with people from a completely different culture and a different approach. And you have to adapt. Something stupid like just our sense of humor. As South Africans, you know, when someone is cracking a joke, and there, it would go unnoticed, or people would not realize that it's actually just a bit of humor coming in. So, from a practical perspective, there was a lot to get used to. And in terms of the way of doing things, it was quite interesting. Our offices were in Eben, which is like the Sandton of Joburg. And once you're there, it's very much the same. Traffic, people rushing to get into the office towers to go to work. So some things change and some don't, actually.
Francois, as we said, you specialize in offshore structuring and estate planning. Why is it that we find that more and more South Africans want to look into offshore structures? More and more South Africans want to take funds offshore. Why is it that we tend to find that in the market these days?
Andre, the world has opened up. With the coming of technology, etc., offshore markets are becoming accessible. Information about offshore markets is more accessible. And I think, to some extent, South Africans have discovered the world also from an investment perspective, not only from traveling and studying abroad and that kind of thing. And to be honest, South Africa is a small market if you look at the global market. So it's really just about 1%. So if you look at it that way, it would actually not make sense to invest all your funds in one market that's such a small market. And I think, that need to diversify. And, sometimes things can get very complicated. But if you keep it simple, if you're investing, you're really just investing, trying to buy into the best companies in the world. And the best companies of the world, although we've got brilliant companies in South Africa, but they're not all here. So you want to invest in the best companies in the world, and that means that you would want to invest offshore. And South Africans, with having quite a fondness of property and investing in property, has obviously also expanded and explored into property investments in various jurisdictions. So I think with just information coming more available, with people understanding, that there's a whole world out there, also from an investment perspective, people have diversified more. Obviously, with that, we also had relaxation and exchange controls. So when I started in estate planning, you had a once-in-a-lifetime offshore allowance of 500,000 Rand in a lifetime, whereas nowadays it's 10 million, and then with the recent changes, 2 million discretionary. So you can actually externalize 12 million Rand in a year. If you think about a couple, it's 24 million in a year. So all of a sudden, you can have quite substantive offshore exposure and diversification quite quickly. And that, I think, just necessitates South Africans to be aware of the planning side. And we've seen that quite a bit, that the planning always catches up afterwards. Yeah. Ideally, you would want to be a little bit more strategic and set your planning in place, from the onset.
And the jurisdictions that you would advise the clients, I know without getting technical, what are those jurisdictions and why are those specific ones relevant? Because I think a lot of people have the question of where do I invest if I want to take it offshore, and what is the best option? So just not too technical necessarily, but just maybe explain or give us more of a bit of an idea on those aspects.
I think, Elani, you need to distinguish between your actual market that you're investing in and the typical jurisdiction where you want to set up your holding entity that will hold those investments. So in terms of the investment market, obviously, as we said, you can now invest globally. So naturally, South Africans have favored the US and Europe because those are jurisdictions that we know. But that would be sort of the market that you invest in. Where you set up your investment holding entity is obviously a jurisdiction that makes sense from a planning perspective. And there your financial centers have been quite popular over many years. The typical names like Jersey, Guernsey, Isle of Man, Mauritius, those kind of jurisdictions. So what they offer is a safe framework, a financial focused sector or industry, and then obviously, a favorable tax treatment for returns generated through investments in those entities. So it would make sense to choose a jurisdiction that complements your investment strategy. So I guess the important thing is it's not a one size fits all. It depends on the client. So if, for example, you're contemplating property investments in Europe, you would probably venture into a different investment holding entity like a SPV to hold those property investments. So it's very specific to what the client wants to achieve.
That makes sense.
Now, Francois, we said now that there's many opportunities and more clients are looking to take funds offshore, to set up offshore structures, offshore trusts and so forth. What do you think is some of the most common misconceptions about offshore structuring and specifically offshore trusts?
I think, Andrew, I get that question quite a bit. And the most common one is, but how do I trust this trustee that I don't even know, who's now taking ownership of the assets in the trust? And to be honest, it's a hurdle that each and every client needs to get over. And it is a challenge. But I often say to clients, I think your investments or assets in an offshore trust is very safe from a regulatory perspective, because in those jurisdictions are highly regulated. There are a list of requirements that you must meet to be able to act as a trust in those jurisdictions. And one shouldn't forget that the financial services sector in those industries is quite an important part of the economic growth of that particular jurisdiction. So they guard it, they look after it, and that's why there are lots of regulation to ensure that the trustees do their job very well. Because the moment you get a reputation that things are not going according to plan, obviously that jurisdiction will just lose business. So I think that's one of the misconceptions, that it's unsafe, or the trustee is not going to implement my wishes or not look after my family the way I would want them to do that. And I think, those things, I've been in the industry long, and I've never come across a professional trustee that has gone rogue and has refused clients' wishes. Obviously within reason. So I think that's the one thing. The other thing is just a lack of coordination with advisors. So sometimes a client would consult a professional to advise on the actual structure, but then not include his financial plan or financial advisor as part of the process. And then also the accounting team that ultimately needs to report on those investments and the structures needs to be part of the process. Otherwise, you get a bit of a disjointed solution where you're always sort of swimming against the tide, because you're catching up on making sure that your admin and your reporting correlates with what you've implemented. So I think those are two things. I think there's another thing is maybe also just a common misconception that offshore structures and offshore trusts are expensive. I always find it quite interesting. If you look at some of the other products that are offered in the marketplace, something that's very popular, and it's a good product, is something like a life wrapper, but at the appropriate level of investment, and if you have a fairly fixed fee on your administration cost of this trust, it actually becomes cheaper than a life wrapper, because a life wrapper, you basically pay a percentage of the assets as a fee for the wrapper. So that's another misconception, that it's very expensive. And I think at the appropriate level of investment, it actually is quite a suitable solution for clients.
Just dwelling quickly off from the misconceptions, I know a lot of questions that clients often ask when it comes to offshore structuring is, how would I ever meet the trustee? Is there clients that have that need from your side, and the overseas companies that you do use, are they involved in a process where they get to meet the clients and vice versa?
Ilani, I think that's very important. And that's why we choose the trustee companies that we cooperate with quite carefully. So we'd like to use offshore management companies that have a significant South African client base, because it means that they come to South Africa quite often to meet with clients. And, we spoke about a client getting over that hurdle that he's giving away control over the assets in favor of the trustee. But if you can actually meet a trustee once or twice a year, that obviously helps quite a bit, because then you can actually face the individual who is taking the decisions. So, yeah, I think that's important. I think it's important to work with reputable firms. And also, it's important to partner with someone that can advise you on the South African tax implications of setting up your structure and capitalizing your structure. So that's often something that we find lacking. You get management companies, so they manage trusts in places like Mauritius or Jersey. They come to South Africa, they will say to clients, we can manage that trust for you. But to be honest, that's actually the easy part. The most difficult part is, how do you incorporate that into your estate planning structure, and how do you capitalize your offshore trust or offshore structure in such a way, that it gives you the benefits that you want from a South African tax perspective. So that's a difficult part. But I think it's important for clients to meet the offshore trustee. It may not be as regular a meeting like with a local trust, but at least once or twice a year, it's good practice to meet with your offshore trustee.
Do you actually think, the clients have a peace of mind knowing that you are the middleman between them and the, offshore trustee, having that, direct contact in South Africa? Do you think clients find value by means of that route?
Yeah, Ilani, we found that added a lot of comfort to clients. So they've got a local contact point. Our office often acts as the liaison office of the offshore trustee. So it means that they can phone someone in South Africa if they want information, or they want to discuss a future investment opportunity, or whatever the case may be. And we found that gave them a lot of comfort. So what we also do is we prefer to partner with one particular trust company in a jurisdiction, which means that we advise all our clients to set up their trust there. So that creates efficiency, and it also keeps us quite close to the trustee. So, we're quite involved in their processes, which means that, we can pick up quickly if something is starting to go wrong. And that installs a bit of comfort with the clients as well.
Trust as well.
Definitely.
From a client perspective. And I think that's so important, especially when you have to, put all your earnings on an offshore side where you have no control.
Yeah, and Francois, that offshore trustee is obviously a critical part of the offshore structure. Obviously, you go through when you've decided ultimately you will utilize for that purposes, you go through a sort of a vetting process. And obviously, you have stringent requirements in terms of that. So, I mean, I also think it can give a client peace of mind that you have basically eliminated all the other possibilities you've considered. You've taken the one which you feel is the most trustworthy, and so forth. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, we do a proper due diligence on a particular trust company before we partner with them. And that gives the clients peace of mind, because, it's like anything else. I mean, there's a whole wide world. You can speak to as many management companies as you'd like, but you wouldn't really know how to distinguish between them. But that's where, we do that legwork, and we do a due diligence. And when we say to the client, look, you can set up your trust in the following jurisdictions. If you choose jurisdiction A, we recommend trust company A, and we've vetted them. And as I said, we then tend to put all our clients' trust with that particular trust company. And that gives the clients a lot of comfort.
Francois, we've spoken about it the other day, where we said that you can get great tax opinions and so forth out there, and great ideas for structures, but you don't necessarily get the people who assist you to implement that. So the people who give you that advice and proposal can't necessarily proceed with the implementation and the ongoing management of that. So you get a great opinion, but you don't really get a well-structured plan that you can implement and manage going forward. In your opinion, what separates a well-structured estate plan from one that simply exists on paper?
I think, Andre, you've alluded to it. It's very important that you have the basics right in terms of understand what you want to achieve and how the tax rules apply to it, etc. But then you're only as good as your implementation is. So I often say to clients, you're only as strong as the paper trail. So you need to ensure that your implementation goes according to plan. And that's why we often say that the architect of the plan must also be involved in the implementation and the ongoing maintenance. And I think that's where, in PH Consult, that's our approach. So we can give the client advice, we can advise on the structure, but then we actually take responsibility for the implementation and we're involved in the ongoing maintenance. And we've got brilliant tax minds in South Africa, so you can get a really great tax opinion and you can walk out after paying the bill and then say, well, where do I start? And I think that's an important part, and that's often what we see lacking. There's an idea, and it's a good idea and a good plan, but then with the implementation of the plan, things sort of fall between the cracks a little bit, and you end up with something that looks different than what you envisage when you design the plan.
It's probably also more cost effective for clients to work with someone who's involved in, the architecture of the plan and then also the execution and implementation of it, where, like Andre mentioned, you can go somewhere and get a proper tax opinion, but then implementing it might be a problem, and then let's say 2 years down the line regulations and legislation changes, then you need to get a new opinion and start a new implementation process. Where with PH Consult, you guys are actively involved, so you guys can mitigate those risks for the clients, which in effect is more cost effective. Is that correct?
Ilani, you touch on something about cost and effectiveness of structure. So what we see quite a bit is we need to do remedial work on structures where the implementation has actually gone wrong, or the design of the plan was a little bit off from the offset. And that obviously comes with associated costs. So it is true that it's cheaper to do something right from the get-go than to do remedial work. So I think that's really important. And as we said, if you get tax advice from someone, but someone else is doing the implementation, it means that you'll need to go back to the advisor every year to find out if things have changed. And as we know, tax laws change all the time. So I think there's comfort in that, and it also makes a lot of sense if the person who's designing the structure is also involved in the ongoing maintenance. So at PH Consult, we're proactive. So we will monitor changes to tax legislation, for example, and we will approach the client and say, look, we think we need to consider adapting the structure where it may be required.
Francois, it's interesting, and we find it on a daily basis almost, where we get clients, they have some form of assets in offshore jurisdictions, but they didn't plan for that, in a sense that they don't, for example, have an offshore will, or they don't know how the succession laws in that specific jurisdiction work. What's the risks for clients who do have these offshore structures in place, but they fail to plan properly across the various jurisdictions?
Yeah, I think unfortunately, we've also seen cases where the planning has gone wrong, and that had some dire consequences. I'm thinking about a case where people got the forced airship rules quite wrong in France, and you may end up with an outcome that is not aligned at all with what the intended sort of objective was. So it's important to revisit and update and make sure that you've got your integrated plan in place. And I think nowadays with the increased offshore investment allowances and the discretionary allowance being increased to 2 million, a local family can actually quite quickly have significant offshore exposure, which means that all of a sudden you've got a substantial asset that you need to think about what's going to happen with it on death. You may actually have exposure to and meet the thresholds for citus tax or death duties in those jurisdictions quite quickly. So it's almost like before you know it, you're over that threshold. So as with all planning, I think it's important to start early, to be proactive, and don't leave it too late.
Francois, and the cross-border compliance is becoming increasingly complex on a yearly basis. Things like the CRS and and so forth. How do you guys at PH Consult help clients to navigate these complexities and to make it easier for them without feeling overwhelmed?
I think as a first step, you need to take the compliance and the regulation framework in mind when you design your structure. So, and that's often sort of not taken into consideration. So we all know that the fiduciary planning and the tax planning is important, but you also need, this is like a third leg that your structure is standing on, is how would reporting be dealt with? And it obviously is a great advantage if you take that into consideration when you start planning your structure. So it's important that should be part of your strategy. And then ultimately what we do is we know how that reporting is going to flow or apply to the structures that we implement for clients. And then what I've said in the beginning is there must be close cooperation with your other advisors. So the people doing your tax returns, etc., need to be on board with what you're doing and what you're implementing. And I've seen this many times where a client has got some advice. He started off, set up a trust, for example, funded it by way of a loan, and then it's 2-3 years later, and then someone realizes, oh, but there should have been interest on that loan, and that should have been reported in the tax return in South Africa. And then you're playing catch up, and that can be also quite a cumbersome and a costly exercise. So I think the most important part is to be aware of that. And I mean, we've all heard about those urban legends in the days when you had a Swiss account and it was a numbered account and nobody knew, that you had that account. So those days are long gone. I think one needs to accept that information is shared across the globe, and you need to plan your structure and plan your affairs so that you're compliant and you're not caught by surprise.
So Francois, you mentioned that obviously you need to consider all the regulations and the changes within the structure. But how do you stay on top of all the ever-changing legislation? Because I mean, while you're busy with implementation, after implementation, the changes continue, or is a continuous process. So what do you do, or what does PH Consult do to stay on top of those changing legislation?
I think that's a benefit of working with a reputable organization. Where you've got a lot of support, you've got a strong back office, we've got the knowledge center, we've got all sorts of resources available that allows us to keep abreast of those changes. And you're right, I mean, it's an ever-changing environment. And that's why it's very difficult for someone who doesn't have a South African focus to stay abreast of the changes that may impact on offshore structures. And then also, once again, coordinating that with the actual implementation, so the people who needs to do the reporting. So, Yolani, I think that's one of the things where we specialize in PH Consult in the offshore planning. It's our bread and butter. So that's what we focus on, and that's often the challenge. You need to have the resources, and you need to apply the resources on something like that. To keep abreast of the changes. But since this is what we do, that's where we apply
part
the
of
resources.
the job.
Yeah. Francois, you've mentioned something interesting where you said that there's a sharing of information between countries. How important is it? I mean, these days we have things like AI, which is just on a different level in terms of compliance and the sharing of information. How important is it for clients to keep in mind that if you have assets in South Africa and you have certain offshore structures in place as well, that the reporting you do is transparent and consistent? I think that's obviously something that clients need to keep in mind. You can't report one thing in South Africa but something entirely different in another jurisdiction, because somewhere, I mean, there's no place to hide, as I understand that.
Yeah, Andre, no, you're right. I think, as we said, the world is opened up for South Africans. It's become a global village, but so does information sharing and information that's available. So I think one should realize that whatever you have from an income perspective or asset perspective, you should accept that information on that is shared with the local authorities. So it's quite unfortunate if you have a mismatch and you've got reporting that doesn't align, and that creates all sorts of administrative issues and tax questions, etc. So I think one would do yourself a favor to make sure that you actually get that right. And what we say to clients is, we can never base any planning on the premise that the information will not be shared or will not get known. You should accept that whatever you have offshore, that information will get shared or will get known by the authorities, and you plan accordingly. So as you said, unfortunately, there's no place to hide.
And I think now with all the, anti-money laundering legislation that came into effect in South Africa, I think South Africans' eyes started to open up to the idea of transparency and disclosures, which kind of, I think, makes it easier for offshore structuring and your clients on that basis to actually, be comfortable with the process of sharing their information.
Ilani, that's quite an interesting point, because in South Africa, we're always catching up a little bit to the international trends. So, yeah, unfortunately, I guess. So, a few years back, clients would get quite frustrated with all the questions that the offshore trustees are asking about source of wealth and source of funds and that kind of thing. But as you say, nowadays, those regulations have caught up with us in South Africa, even, since we were on the grey list and luckily got off the grey list. But it's now part and parcel of our lives, is everybody wants to know everything. So as you say, I think clients are now getting more accustomed to it. But it's really just us catching up with what the trend has been for a long time internationally.
Now, Francois, I think you've mentioned now you've been on the grey list for quite some time. At least we're off that now. But I think it was quite a wake-up call for not only for clients, but also for the regulating authorities in South Africa. And for clients especially. We've seen it now with the trusts and everything. Clients now start to realize that there's actually a lot of risk in non-compliance. And that's why it's critical that your staff must be compliant and up to date, and irrespective of the jurisdiction you are in. Francois, I on a daily basis see the misconception that people have that estate planning is only for your high net worth or ultra wealthy clients, which is in my view not the case. When do you think is it realistically the right time for someone to start with estate planning? I think, just perhaps to give my view, I think as soon as you have any form of asset, it's good to have some form of estate planning in place. Estate planning will obviously look different for every client. Someone who, for example, just owns a house and a bank account, a will is sufficient. But someone who, for example, have investment portfolios and various other assets and asset classes, and especially as they become higher in value, your estate plan will look quite a lot different. But when do you feel is it the right time for someone to realistically start with a estate plan?
Well, Andre, I think as soon as you have an estate. So I think the misconception is that it only becomes important when you get to a certain level. But the point is, you need to start early with the planning, so that when it gets to that level, there's no point in what's much more difficult to start implementing your strategy when you've already amassed all the wealth in your personal name. So I think the question to that is as soon as possible. And if I may, I think sometimes young people are advised incorrectly. I've seen young people, professionals who they not married, they don't have any liabilities yet, but they've got life cover, like it makes your eyes water, and that's just wrong advice. I think there's a place for life cover, and obviously it becomes quite an important tool in your estate planning process, but the right level at the right time. So, but that in itself is already estate planning. As you say, well, if something happens to me, how is this gonna play out? So I think the answer to the question is as early as possible, as soon as you start amassing assets and generate income. And then obviously, as you said, the level of complexity goes up, the higher the value of the estate is, and the more assets you get together. But the point is the process, I think, should start early.
I think that's where it gets important to be involved with, specialists that have an integrated approach, because every year your circumstances may change. Yeah. So it means your structures might need to be amended or restructured in some form. And I think that's what makes, PH Consult so unique in this sense, especially when it becomes or when it comes to a high level net worth client based on the assets that they've built up over the years?
Yeah, I think it's a journey that you need to embark on, and it's fascinating. And I've recently met clients with a large estate, but they haven't even considered the concept of a trust. It's a foreign idea. I'm talking about even a local trust. And sometimes you think, but how is it possible that this family could amass so much wealth and nobody ever spoke to them about estate planning? And it's not an urban legend. I mean, it happens. I mean, we come across that. So I think, as you say, Ilani, to partner with advisors that could actually look after you and sort of hold your hand along the way. Initially, as you said, Andre, it may be just a will. But then a few years later, you may incorporate a South African trust into the planning. And then a couple of years later, you may start thinking about offshore structures. But you need to partner with someone that can advise on your total estate.
Yeah, and as you said, Francois, someone that can walk the journey with you. Francois, Ilani asked the question, and you've answered that earlier with regards to how important it is for a client to trust that offshore trustee. But in general, how important is it for a client to trust you as the advisor? Specifically with regards to, what we're busy with on a daily basis is generational planning, whether it is local or offshore. How important is that relationship of trust? As you also said now, in principle, we want to walk the journey with the client. You want to take his hand and walk the journey, ultimately from someone who start off with a house at a young age as a professional, for example, ending up on date of retirement with a high in value estate, but hopefully structured correctly during his lifetime. And now you can take his hand also through retirement. How important is that trust between client and advisor?
Well, Andre, I think in practice, the reality is that you're not going to implement advice from someone that you don't trust. It's a bit like going to a doctor or specialist, and he tells you need this operation, but you're not going to do it. So I think it's of paramount importance to build that trust relationship with your advisor. And as with all relationships, it gets established over time, and you build on it. Think about your family doctor. It's someone that you've been going to for a long time, and you've established that relationship of trust, and then your kids go there and they start to know him, and then one day they take their kids, if he's in practice for that long. But essentially, you're not going to implement advice from someone you don't trust. And that's a concern if I think about, there are many actors in this marketplace. Some of them are punting products, and it's a solution or product, and it's going to give you this benefit, and it's an in and out. And often, we meet clients who've implemented that product, and it's 2-3 years later that advisor or broker, whoever, is no longer around, and they ask themselves the question, "But why do I have this? Is it really what I need?" And that's where, if you build that relationship of trust with an advisor, I think you'll end up in a much better place.
Would you say that building trust with the clients initially starts with the client service that you offer them, and then initially it's like rolls over into those personal relationships that you build?
I think it's an important building block. I mean, obviously, if you don't know someone, you need to first establish that they can actually deliver what they promise. So that initial service delivery is quite important in terms of just establishing that, okay, I can actually trust what you say. But essentially, it's just one building block. I think the other part of it is, do you really listen to what my needs are as the client? Do you understand what the challenges are that we face as a family? And then obviously, do you have the skill and expertise to recommend workable solutions, to our challenges? So Ilani, I think that efficiency and correct implementation is quite an important building block, but it's one of the building blocks. I think it's important to also make sure you have the other building blocks in place as well.
Francois, you've probably during your careers seen various successful and unsuccessful succession stories. I mean, you've shared a few of us where simply as a result of poor advice and planning. The outcome for the client is actually shocking. How important is it, or actually not how important is it, but what do you think is some of the biggest mistakes clients make with regards to planning, especially when they have assets across multiple jurisdictions?
I think what often happens with clients is they identify an investment opportunity, and often it's like, well, now's the time. You need to get into this opportunity, whether it's buying a property or buying an equity stake in a business or a listed share, whatever the case may be. And then the planning comes as an afterthought. So that's often where things start to go wrong a little bit. And I think the moment you start amassing assets across the globe, the one thing that we also state in PH Consult is we're not specialists in each and every jurisdiction. So you need to involve specialist advisors in that jurisdiction, especially on things like property investments. But what is important is that you have a local advisor that you're partnering with and that you trust, and he must basically be the conductor. So everything gets correlated with that advisor. You get input from the specialist in Spain and in the UK and then wherever you own assets. But somewhere someone needs to integrate all of this and make sure that it aligns with your strategy. And I've often seen that falling by the wayside, where you've got input from different specialists in different jurisdictions, and company X or a structure Y would work for that particular investment. But how does it fit into the bigger strategy and the plan? And that's often where I find it lacking. So it's important to have that conductor that basically says, okay, well, how does all of this come together?
Francois, and offshore structuring is often purely associated with tax planning. And I mean, it's obvious you want the most tax efficient offshore structure for a client in place, but how much of your work is actually not just on tax efficiency, but building the relationship with the client, advising and assisting with the ongoing management?
I think, Andre, it's ultimately about clients' dreams, if you think about it. And it's about dreams and objectives, even for the next generation. And nowadays, when we started out, it was, sometimes you get a client who has a child that studies overseas. Nowadays, South African families are multi-jurisdictional, if I can call it that. You've got people who emigrated, some studying abroad, some owns a business in a different jurisdiction. So it's really about putting that plan together in such a way that the client actually have peace of mind that ultimately, when he or she is no longer there, there's a strategy in place. So that peace of mind part of it, and there's nothing like having a proper plan in place to give you that peace of mind. But that, in my mind, is actually the most important. And then we must make sure that the structure is tax efficient and all of that. But I think one should start at the beginning.
Francois, technology and things like AI are changing the world at a rapid pace. How do you see estate planning evolve over the next 10 or 20 years?
Well, Andrea, I think the building blocks of your structure or your plan needs to take into account the regulatory environment, the sharing of information. So I think it's going to become even more important to be very strategic in how you own assets and how you structure that, and also the flow of assets ultimately to the next generation. So I think what has transpired through all of this development is that information is just so readily available, and I think it's sometimes a mindset that clients need to adjust to and say, well, it's all out there, and how do I want to present that information to the world? I think that's ultimately the question. If we think about us being in South Africa, perhaps our clients' risks and things that I worry about is different from clients in developed markets, places like the UK or America, whatever the case may be. So if you take into consideration that whatever information that has bearing on you or your estate or your assets can actually be readily available to anyone who does a little bit of research, you need to take that into account and factor that into your estate planning process.
Sorry, Andre, before you proceed, do you think AI software would be involved in estate planning in the next 10 to 20 years, or don't you think that would be relevant in the scope of work that you attend to on a daily basis?
I think it will, definitely, Ilania. I think AI is really found application in each and every little thing that you can think about. So I don't think estate planning as a discipline or as a science would circumvent that. So, but I think we can also be used to our advantage. So, I think that will definitely be part of the picture going forward.
I do think AI would make life a lot easier, especially if it's, set up correctly and created correctly. It can actually be very beneficial and also be, time efficient at the end of the day.
Yeah, definitely.
Francois, on a more personal level, beyond the technical and legal side of your daily work, what do you enjoy to do outside of work?
Andre, I'm quite a nature lover, so I enjoy the outdoors and a bit of overlanding and camping. And my wife and I are keen birders, so that's quite an interest and a hobby. So yeah, just love nature and love being outdoors.
Francois, what did your career up until now teach you about life?
I think that life is unpredictable, but you can actually plan and strategize, to make provision for eventualities. And the big thing, and I think we've alluded to earlier, is one needs to be intentional about planning and structuring. It doesn't just happen. You need to think about it. And what I've seen through my career and engaging with many families and clients is that ultimately, if you talk about legacy and that kind of thing, leaving assets or wealth to a next generation, I think is something that everybody wants. But ultimately, handing it to them in a controlled fashion so that things are orderly, that adds a lot to the legacy. And if you don't have that, you can leave your kids or your spouse or whatever a lot of money, but if it's all in a mess, it basically taints that legacy. So I think there's a lot to be said for a bit of structuring and planning.
Francois, as this is the life and legacy talks, when people one day speak about Francois, what is the legacy you hope to have left behind?
I think on a professional level, I would want clients to say I assisted them in making their dreams come true in terms of providing for their loved ones and the next generation, and also making things that may seem a little bit complicated, understandable, and to implement solutions that works, and that ultimately showed up, that it did work in the end. So that's from a professional perspective, and then from a personal perspective, I think we're custodians of blessings and talents and opportunities that's given to us, and I would want to leave that legacy to say I was a good custodian of what was handed to me.
Yeah. Francois, it's a privilege to work with you. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. We know you're very busy, so thanks for making the time in your schedule. It's much appreciated from our side, and we've appreciated that you came all the way here to share some of your knowledge with us.
Oh, thank you. It was a privilege.